By the times.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, we're going to go live on YouTube, and we're live. It is Wednesday, December 22nd, 5:04 p.m. Eastern Time, and we are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have Radley Balko on to talk about. I swear to God, I really thought this was going to be a story about the Clintons or something, because it's called Big Trouble in Little Rock, although it's a pretty great headline. But Radley, welcome back to the show. It is great to see you, and I'm really excited to talk about the story. Yeah.
Have me on. Be back.
Good to see you. So tell us about it. What damage have you done?
Well, this is.
So I should say that this came out in the Intercept this week, right? And I put a link to it in the Twitter feed, but I will drop a link to it here too. So.
So this is a story I've been working on for about 18 months now. I don't think I've ever interviewed more people for a story. I think we had over 40 sources and thousands of pages of documents. And basically the gist of it is back in 2018, I wrote a piece about how the Little Rock Police Department was conducting these really violent no-knock raids that were actually illegal, because I reviewed a lot of the search warrants, and I won't get into the law too much, but basically they were violating a Supreme Court case that said you had to be very specific about the evidence that you cited to justify the use of a no-knock warrant. And they were just cutting and pasting language, and then they were using like explosives to literally like blow the doors off of people's homes.
Wow.
So I wrote about this, and it became a factor in the mayoral race. One of the candidates had already been running on a police reform platform, and kind of took up the no-knock cause. Also, he won, ended up being the first Black elected mayor of Little Rock since Reconstruction, and he appointed this reformist Black police chief named Keith Humphrey to kind of carry out his reform agenda. And since then, Humphrey has just been hit left and right and every other way. With
what kind of reform agenda? Can you like be more specific? Like, I mean, just because there's so many.
Sure. These were actually pretty mild reforms as far as that kind of thing goes. One was a reform of the no-knock policy, and that actually worked. They went from 57 no-knock raids the year before Humphrey took over to, I think he said he signed 4 in the 2 years he's been there. But also he ordered a top-down review of the department and its sort of personnel procedures, looking into issues like racial profiling, use of force, de-escalation policy. And then a few of the things Humphrey did that were sort of more internal-facing actually sparked even more controversy within the department. So he instituted, for example, an anti-nepotism policy. So you had, in Little Rock, you had officers who were working side by side with spouses who had direct relatives in their chain of command, like sons and daughters and brothers. You had twin brothers working side by side in the same unit, all of which is really
confusing. That's so confusing.
It's confusing, but it's also just bad sort of policy and bad for morale within the department. Right. And so, a lot of these policies were very, very sort of common sense. I talked to other policing experts who said, this shouldn't even be controversial. But the problem in Little Rock is that the police union, the FOP there, is really powerful and has kind of run the department for decades. And so the article it looks at the accusations. So basically, when Humphrey took over, almost from the start, he had definitely from the very first day, he had a controversial police shooting awaiting him. And his internal affairs department found that this officer violated LRPD policy, which says that you can't fire, not only can you not fire into a moving vehicle, but if you have the option of getting out of the way, you have to get out of the way. You can't put yourself in the direct line of a vehicle and then claim that you had no choice but to use deadly force to defend yourself, or the vehicle would have hit you. And in this case, the officer basically starts firing at this vehicle from the driver's side, and then positions himself in front of the vehicle. And as the vehicle sort of slowly rolls toward him, he climbs up onto the hood and continues firing through the windshield and kills this guy. And so Humphrey
kidding. After like all of that firing into the driver's side, that's like kind of insane.
when there's a passenger in the car who could have been hurt, there was somebody in a nearby car that the officer's bullet struck. This officer also had a history. And so Humphrey, his internal affairs department determined this officer violated policy. And so Humphrey fired him. And that just inspired this massive backlash from the department almost immediately. And there was a hearing by what's called the Civil Service Commission. And that's who you sort of appeal to if you're a police officer and you get fired. And at that hearing, a lot of officers testified in defense of this officer. They were really upset that he was fired. And because of that, the reforms that Humphrey then tried to implement afterward were recast by his critics within the department, not as sensible reforms for a troubled department, but as retaliation, as him sort of taking it out on these officers who contradicted his firing this officer. So, for example, one sort of common sense reform he did was he rotated all of his command staff to different divisions. And this is a thing police departments are supposed to do every few years because you don't want people building little fiefdoms. You want to get sort of new blood in different divisions. And you also, from the standpoint of the officers, you want to get them lots of experience in different areas because that helps their careers when they try to move on to other departments or move up and get promoted. And this was cast not as these sort of sensible reforms, but that he was rotating these commanders because they had testified against them, and this is retaliation. And then he starts getting these lawsuits one after another. In the end, I think there were 7 lawsuits filed by at least 12 different officers. He gets a really damaging letter from his command staff. 10 of the 13 members of his command staff signed this letter saying that he had created a hostile work environment and that they couldn't work for him anymore. And, this becomes pretty damning, and this momentum starts to build against this guy. So, I because I had done some previous reporting in Little Rock, Humphrey's attorney came to me and said, you got to look at this. A lot of these accusations are just completely flimsy. And sure enough, as I started looking into the lawsuits and some of the claims in the lawsuits, they were just, it was clear that they were not designed to win in court. They were designed to sort of build public momentum for this chief's ouster. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One from the story. So there was one. There was two female officers sued Humphrey and claimed retaliation, but also gender discrimination. And in the lawsuit, their attorney points to this one particular incident where a black woman officer claimed that her supervisor had been basically sort of harassing her and had created a hostile work environment for her. And in the lawsuit, it says that Humphrey acknowledges that this was a hostile work environment, and yet instead of doing anything about it, he simply transferred this officer. So the implication is that he tolerated this hostile work environment, right? Well, so I actually called the officer who this was in reference to. And she said when she saw the lawsuit, she was livid because they had completely mischaracterized what happened. Now, this is somebody that the lawsuit names as sort of an ally, right? And she said, actually what happened was she did file a complaint, and Humphrey was the only one who took it seriously. And in fact, the assistant chief who was suing Humphrey in that lawsuit basically faulted her for the hostile work environment and said, why are you here if you're facing these kinds of, you should transfer or you should quit. And so, when you have a lawsuit that names specifically names someone who's going to back you up in these accusations, and then I call that person.
Yeah, you get into kind of Rule 11 territory where you're making allegations not in
right.
that to be not effectively supportable.
The slightest bit of due diligence would have revealed. And I found this over and over again. There was this accusation in a separate lawsuit by the same lawyer that Humphrey had transferred these 2 officers as retaliation because one of them testified in contradiction to him at this hearing, and that as added humiliation, he had notified them of their transfer by text message in the middle of the night. Well, I
can you remind me what these were filed under, by the way? Under what? Were these
under Arkansas state law? Basically, as
Arkansas state. Okay,
yeah.
Okay, that was what I was wondering. If they were federal law, if they were under chapter 7 or something. But yeah, okay. But no, that would be hiring and firing. But I was just curious if there was any of that too.
Well, there are a lot of EEOC complaints against Humphrey as well. But in this case, they claim that he purposely notified them of their transfer by text in the middle of the night to humiliate them. Which, I'm not sure that notifying somebody by text in the middle of the night is is a grievable offense in any case. But even then, it wasn't true, because I saw the text messages, and Humphrey had actually asked his assistant chief, the other assistant chief who was suing him, to tell the officers in person and to let them know he was there if they wanted to talk about it. She then delegated that to somebody who notified them by text in the middle of the night and admitted so in a text. So this attorney in one lawsuit makes this allegation on behalf of his clients that his client in another suit is actually responsible for, and that he should have known. But it actually gets a lot worse. One of the biggest allegations against Humphrey is that he was sexually harassing women. And there is a text message that I got a hold of from the female assistant chief who's suing him, which was sent sort of late at night. I think it was like 12:30 in the morning. And it basically is to 5 women, 4 white, 1 black, saying, I understand that Humphrey has said sexually inappropriate things to all of you. We need to all come forward and make these allegations. Well, the one black woman on that list was kind of shocked.
This is where the story opens, right?
Right. Was shocked because she had nothing to accuse him of. And in fact, she had never heard of any of this. And, she said, so she did not come forward. The rest of them responded to the text that they would come forward with their own allegations. And she, ends up over the next few days, she says she gets pressured by these other women on the text to come forward, even though she tells them she's got nothing to accuse them of. She ends up filing her own complaint with HR, but she gets a call from HR also sort of asking her if she has.
Wait, she files a complaint against Humphrey or against
no, she files a complaint against the other women who are pressuring her, right? That complaint goes nowhere.
So and like this is this where the line like you have to get on the lawsuit train comes from, right? Which is like one of the best, most sinister lines that I've ever heard. I mean, honestly, like it's just like the use of the law to coerce and intimidate people and like.
Well, but there's also there's also a really important kind of racial component to this, which is you have basically a bunch of white women accusing a black chief of sexually harassing them, and there's a lot of evidence. Well, actually, we know now that the report that the city, the investigation for the report for the city's investigation is sealed, but I know people who have seen it, and none of the accusations rise to the level of sexual harassment. In fact, there are things like one of the women had a Hispanic boyfriend who she referred to around the office as my Mexican. And Humphrey asked her to stop doing that. And she said, well, he doesn't mind. And Humphrey said, well, that's not appropriate, even if he doesn't mind. And she filed a hostile work environment against him for that. That was one of the accusations. The others were these sort of innocuous phrases he would use, like take one for the team and tricking fund, which is sort of an African-American phrase of it's like a fund a husband keeps set aside for, golfing or poker that his wife doesn't know about. And these were all characterized by his critics as sexual harassment. And this has echoes to the first Little Rock police chief, black police chief, who was also a reformer, who was also chased out of office by the FOP, also in part with allegations of sexual impropriety with a white woman. And so you get these, there are, and this is what bothered this black sergeant who got the text messages. He's like, this is still Arkansas. She said, I'm from the country. There are white supremacist groups around here. People hear that this black police chief is sexually harassing white women, that puts him in danger. And she thought she had to sort of, blow the whistle about this. And so that's kind of where it starts. And it all kind of goes downhill from there. And we basically, then from there, the article gets into a history of race and racism at the Little Rock Police Department. And I ended up interviewing over 20 current and former black officers who just talked about kind of the systemic racism there, that black officers were passed over promotions, training opportunities, but also they were any black officer who sort of spoke out about racial profiling, about use of force, they were sort of punished. They were stopped in their tracks. Their careers went nowhere. Whereas if you were a black officer who sort of did what the union wanted, you could be okay. You could kind of survive as a police officer. But I'll let you ask some questions now because I've been talking.
Yeah, no. So I have a ton of questions. You kind of told us how you came to this story because you were covering stuff in Little Rock, and that's kind of like, but you did this digging for like 18 months. Did the story of what I'm curious about is like, did it take 18 months to like like dig up the history of what had happened, or was it happening as you were reporting it? Like
both.
what? Okay, yeah, both.
So it was a lot of, it was 6 months of interviewing people, digging up documents, going through, emails, making open records requests, all of that. But then, as I'm reporting it, it continues to evolve. And so, to give you one example of the court, while I was doing the story, the city had hired this outside investigator to look into some of these allegations against Humphrey. And it was a very bizarre hire. It was this woman at Arkansas Tech who was a marketing professor. And, she had some HR experience, but she had no law enforcement background at all. And a lot of the things she was being asked to investigate were whether Humphrey's firing of a particular officer was justified, or whether it was some sort of retaliation or discrimination. And, at one point she emails the director of HR in Little Rock and basically says Humphrey's guilty of reverse racial discrimination, that he's, taking his whatever out on white officers. But as it turns out, as the investigation was going on, she had donated to the GoFundMe of one of the officers whose firing she was investigating. And when her email to the HR director was leaked, if I'm an impartial investigator and I send an email with preliminary conclusions to the person who hired me, and that gets leaked to the press while the investigation is ongoing, I'm angry, right? Like that jeopardizes the investigation. Well, she touted the leaked email reports on Facebook and directed all of her Facebook people to go read the article. She defended the officer who was fired on Facebook, and she directed her Facebook followers to go donate to his GoFundMe. This is the very person who was supposed to be impartially investigating all of this. Same with there was another internal affairs investigation about Humphrey. That investigator also donated to this officer's GoFundMe. It's, I think what it shows is just how entrenched and embedded kind of the power structure in Little Rock was, and Humphrey is a threat to it. And so everybody kind of pulled out all the stops. They have pulled out the stops to make sure that, he's not successmesual.
Give us a little.
Who's coordinating this? Is this a police union thing? Is this you can't do this kind of thing in a fully distributed way. Somebody's got to be running it. Who's running it?
So there are a couple things. The two high-ranking officers, I think, who are kind of behind this primarily are the two assistant chiefs who wanted Humphrey's job. They both applied for his job and did not get it. So he comes into the Little Rock Police Department with 2 of his 3 direct subordinates already.
Okay, so that's actually huge. So, but related to that, can you give us a little bit of exposition as you're doing this too, along like where Humphrey totally comes from and why he upset the establishment in Little Rock? Because it sounds like it's not just that he's a reformer and he's Black. It sounds like he's an outsider. And go ahead.
Yeah, I think he started in Texas, and I get into his background a little bit. He was hired he initially applied with the Dallas Police Department and was turned down because they told him he was too nice to become a police officer. He ends up in Fort Worth, where he says, he gets into trouble.
Like the most depressing thing I've ever heard. Sorry.
He ends up in Fort Worth, where he runs into problems because it's the 80s and he's hearing officers, use the N-word over the radio, in staff meetings. He complains about it, and that doesn't make him particularly popular. Officers are slow to respond when he needs backup. So he ends up in Arlington, Texas. And the Arlington Police Department has kind of a history and tradition of producing these kind of reformist, you might say progressive police leaders who go on to lead other departments. And he rises through the ranks there, ultimately gets hired to become the police chief in Lancaster, Texas, and then gets hired to be chief in Norman, Oklahoma. Lancaster, he had very little problems. It's a pretty small department, a small city. Norman, he runs into a little bit of resistance, but he ultimately kind of wins people over. I interviewed former colleagues in Norman, and one interesting thing is, after he left Norman and during the George Floyd protest, there was this debate over the Hold Defund movement, which led to a recall petition against the mayor there. And people on both sides of that fight in Norman both had nothing but good things to say about Humphrey, which made me think that, it was hard to find any colleague in one of his former places of employment who had complaints about him. Then he comes to Little Rock, and all of a sudden, within a year, he's allegedly sexually harassed 12 women. He's having an affair with a woman with whom he's trying to get a high-paying job in the department. He's swearing at people, slamming doors, retaliating. And it seemed like a pretty dramatic, personality change in someone to happen within a year. And so that's, I think that I took that as pretty strong evidence that the allegations, I probably wouldn't withstand a little scrutiny. And the more I looked into them, the more that proved to be correct. So it's these two assistant chiefs who wanted his job. One thing about Little Rock, the police department, the union represents every officer for collective bargaining purposes. They represent sergeants and lower, but in terms of representation, if you're facing disciplinary action, any officer in the department who pays dues can get union representation, excluding the chief. So everybody but the chief. And what that means is that if you get an outsider who comes in and wants to implement some reforms, and he gets resistance, which any outsider who wants to implement reforms is going to get, he has to try to implement those reforms with a command staff that's going to be pretty hostile to him. And that makes it really, really difficult for outsiders to get anything done. And that's why, the first black chief in Little Rock basically was run out of town after 5 years. The union in that case took out a billboard with his picture on it. They sent officers to the airport in street clothes to tell, when there's a conference in town, to tell people the city wasn't safe and they should just find a plane and go back home. I had multiple officers tell me about that. There's the affair with
Jesus.
The and so it's
thin blue line indeed. So thin that it can do the bobbing and weaving necessary to discriminate based on race.
Right. And over the years, they've the union has represented white officers when they bring these reverse discrimination suits against these reformist chiefs. I asked, the 20 black officers that I interviewed, 20 plus for the article, if they could think of a single time that the union has represented a black officer in a traditional discrimination suit. And to one, every one of them laughed when I asked that question. So there's the union it's a good old boy system. And in fact, one of the chiefs who replaced one of the reformist chiefs proudly said that we were going to bring back the good old boy system when he was named chief.
So you're describing a relationship between senior management minus the chief and the union that's pretty antithetical to any conventional idea of what a union is and what it does, right? It's basically a union co-opted by the sub-chief senior management, or maybe sub-chief senior management co-opted by the union. And what they all have in common is whiteness. Is that overstating it? Or
it's overstating a little in that one of the assistant chiefs who wanted Humphrey's job is black and who sued him. Now, if you talk to other black officers, they will say that the reason why that assistant chief is popular with the union is because he has spent the last several years of his career sort of advocating against black officers. So he, one point said, there's a black police union in Little Rock also, which rose out of kind of necessity because the white union wasn't representing black officers. And this assistant chief, who's black, tried to dissolve the union, or basically told them that they should merge with the FOP. So it's not, that there are complications to the kind of racial narrative, but it's one of those sort of exception that proves the rule kind of situation. Mm-hmm.
So can I also just add, I think you and I have talked about this before. I've talked about it on the show, which is just that, like, in my time briefly of being clerking in federal court, and the number of discrimination claims that I heard, and like reading through like fact patterns. And this actually was really interesting to do it in the district court on a motion to dismiss, and then to see what actually goes to trial and goes to a jury and then makes its way to like the circuit court. What you said before about like discrimination and like these types of kind of like things that you would call like, it's so incredible that they really are, even if they go all the way to trial, are like so thin. Like most of there's just huge amounts of doubt about what is meant by any of these kind of by statements. How much of things are based on race versus like people just don't like this person, things like that. And so like, I just want to say that like this type of like what's really but like, I say that part of why I say that was like, I was sitting in front of a number of cases that were 9 fucking years old and had cost police departments X number of dollars to defend, or to defend, had cost like the person making the claim X number of dollars to bring. And then still there was no resolution on these facts, like when they were kind of like, and like, but what I'm trying to say is like, that is why it is such, like, even just making the allegations is such an incredible threat, because it is just so costly. And if you get down to it, people will take the rubber to the road and kind of like, make their gamble with discovery.
We haven't seen none of the reverse discrimination claims that I know of have been successful. They were all thrown out in federal court. A number of the traditional discrimination claims were settled by the city. But I will say this: I mean, if you look through kind of the court filings, there's some pretty damning stuff in there. But what was I going to say? Lost my train of thought.
So
next question.
Before we go to audience questions, I want to ask you about the resolution of this thing. Is Humphrey still there? Has he been thoroughly demoralized and ousted? What is the state of play right now?
So he's still there. He's still sort of adamant that he has no intention to leave. Thus far, the mayor has stood beside him, although I was told that the mayor was not happy with Humphrey talking to me for the story. But he also kind of felt he had to get his side of this out there. But, the mayor's up for re-election. And I think it's probably safe to say that if he loses, Humphrey will not be the police chief anymore. There's also, there's among the city directors, which is what Little Rock calls its city council. There's a sizable minority that aren't happy with him. There have been 2 scheduled votes of no confidence, which has never happened before in Little Rock. Both times they were withdrawn at the last minute, but they were scheduled says something.
What's the crime rate like in Little Rock?
It's gone up under Humphrey like it has in every decent sized city in the country. I don't think it's gone up more than in other cities. And, because of the pandemic, it's quirky. There's some areas where it's higher than other cities of its size, some areas where it's lower. What I kind of find really striking was just the absolute sort of emptiness of the allegations when you actually start looking into them. And before you take questions, I do want to talk about it because I think it's really
no. I was actually gonna I think we're gonna wait a few minutes to take questions, but I was gonna say also I wanted you to talk about the source you burned.
Yeah, so that's what. That's
what you're gonna talk about. Ben, also, did we cut you off? Did you have a question to follow up on?
No.
Okay, sorry.
I have one more question, but it can wait. Let's talk about the burned source first.
So there's a guy named Chris Burks who's the one who filed almost all of the lawsuits against Humphrey, and so of course I reached out to him last year, over a year ago now, and he agreed to an interview off the record with the sort of understanding that after that background sort of interview, I would then send him questions over email that he could answer on the record. And so I started talking to him in our off the record agreement, which I'm going to violate now, and I'll tell you why. Anytime I'm interviewing a hostile source off the record, I've had, in the past, I've noticed that they will use your off the record agreement as kind of a weapon to try to lie to you, to throw you off the story because they know that they can't be held accountable because it's off the record, or they think they can't be held accountable.
Not like a binding legal agreement.
Exactly. So, even as a journalist, if a source lies to you, you're no longer bound by that agreement. And so Burks, we had one of the most surreal conversations I've ever had as a journalist with a source. He opened our conversation by flattering me, by telling me that I and Dave Weigel are his 2 favorite journalists, which may be true of Weigel, but I did not believe that about me at all. He claimed that he was, voted for Barack Obama. He's a progressive. He told me about all the civil rights legislation.
Did he get his voting records? No, I'm just kidding. Sorry.
It was such a strange way to start an interview, right? Just throwing all this sort of puffery at me. So, anytime I interview a hostile source, one way I try to test their credibility is I ask them questions that I already know the answer to, right? And if they are honest with me, then I know I can at least sort of trust them going forward a little bit. If they lie to me, then I know, that I'm dealing with somebody who's willing to lie to me. And Burks failed that test, right off the bat. So he starts, rattling off the names of all these women who he claimed were going to bring sexual harassment charges against Humphrey. I knew that some of them weren't true because I had talked to them. And he would say things like, "Oh, so the woman who had with the hostile work environment complaint, right? The one who said that the lawsuit had completely mischaracterized it. So he names her as one of the women who were going to complain against Humphrey. And I said, well, I actually talked to her, and she said that's you completely mischaracterized what happened in your lawsuit. And so he went from saying, you should talk to this woman, she'll confirm what I'm saying, thinking I hadn't talked to her yet, at which point I said I did talk to her and she's contradicting you, at which point he says, well, she's just lying to you because she's black and she feels like she has to defend Humphrey because he's black, right? So he changes his story in mid-conversation about this particular police officer. So it kind of continues that way. And, at this point, I know he's lying to me, but I'm not going to burn him at this point because whatever, he's a source who lied to me. That happens a lot. Then something really strange
Can you just
happened.
define burning for the audience?
Burning a source is when you name the source who gave you bad information because they gave you bad information because they were trying to mislead you and they don't deserve anonymity at that point.
I would say I would say that burning a source. Well, I would just burning. It doesn't have to be for noble and for reasons like that. You can burn a source, even if they didn't give you bad information.
Burning a source is
revealing their identity,
the
right?
identity of a source whom you promised confidentiality.
Right, exactly.
But there is an understanding
that
you promise confidentiality in order for them to provide you truthful information. Right. And if somebody turns around and lies to you, or as also happens, lies about your interactions elsewhere, they're violating the contract under which you agreed to anonymity.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened here. So not only did he lie to me in our conversation, I then find out that he had emailed Humphrey's attorneys and claimed. So during our conversation, he gave me some information that he said came out in a deposition that week, and the deposition was sealed. And so he told me he was violating the protective order on this deposition because he thought I needed to know, right? And he said, I'm going to try to get the seal lifted. I'm going to get you a transcript so you can see, and you'll see that it confirms what I'm saying. He never tried to get the seal lifted because I don't think he never had any intention.
Knew what that would entail, right. Yes.
So instead, he tells me the stuff that he admits to me was in the deposition, and the deposition was sealed. So he's admitting to me that he's violating court order as he's telling me this, right? I later find out that what he tells me, surprise, surprise, is completely untrue. So I'll give you what it was. So Humphrey was accused of Chris Burks accused Humphrey of having an affair with this woman who was applying for a position at the LRPD, an administrative position, right? Yikes. And the evidence for this, Humphrey is friends with this woman. The evidence is that his car was at her house early one morning, right? And an LRPD cruiser caught it on its dash cam, right? Humphrey, there's a good reason why he was there. The woman's car had been stolen the night before. He was bringing some documents by. She confirmed all this. So this all goes big in the Little Rock press, right? Police chief having an affair with woman, blah, blah, blah. They both deny the affair. Burks tells me that in deposition, Humphrey...
He's married? Is he married?
Yes, he's married, yeah.
Okay.
Burks tells me that in the deposition, Humphrey admitted that he was at this woman's house again and that he lied about being at her house. And of course, the clear implication is that the affair continued, that he lied to cover it up. So I asked Humphrey about this, and he says, yeah, I was at her house. He said, we're friends. He's like, I was having dinner at her house with my wife and a male friend of hers. It was a dinner party. And somebody, this blogger who's been sort of an antagonist to Humphrey, texted him while he was at the house with a photo of his truck parked in the driveway saying, is this you? And Humphrey says, I lied to him. I told him, no, that's not my truck. And he's like, because it was clear someone was following or stalking my wife and I wasn't going to admit to them where I was, right? So Burks had characterized this testimony that came out in a sealed deposition as like damning information where Humphrey admits to having this affair. And actually what it was he and his wife were having dinner with this woman and a male friend, and this blogger, was sort of stalking them. And Burks tells me this, thinking that our conversation is protected by the confidentiality agreement or the off the record agreement. So he's trying to throw me off the story, saying, basically, if you run with the story, you're going to be really embarrassed because here's some information I have, that's really going to embarrass you if you let this out. So
what a fucking idiot, by the way. Sorry.
So not only does he lie to me about our conversation, though, he then lies to Humphrey's attorneys. He tells them that I told him things in our conversation that Humphrey told me that violated the protective order, right? Well, that's not true because I hadn't actually talked to Humphrey since before those depositions. But then Burks goes further. He files a motion in court for contempt, asking for the court to find Humphrey in contempt for violating the protective order. And in his motion, he claims that I told him this information that implicates Humphrey for violating the protective order. So he's lying about our conversation in a court filing, thinking that he's going to be protected by the off the record agreement. So that's why I wrote a column for the Post laying it all out and saying, my business here isn't Humphrey. It's you're using my agreement with you to lie in a court filing. And he was found in contempt and found to violated his legal ethics for that.
So I want to ask you about one possible conclusion from this. Is that when we see a rash of harassment suits against a person, we should be skeptical of them. That, like this time it's Humphrey, but, sometimes it's Harvey Weinstein, right? Or, and that, now I'm not here protesting for the innocence of Harvey Weinstein, but I am saying when there are powerful people who oppose the position that somebody is taking in an industry or in a position, weaponizing civil rights law can be a pretty viable strategy. And so my question is, did this story teach you anything about when to be skeptical of, I'm really comfortable saying 22 women are not making up sexual harassment and sexual assault claims against Donald Trump. Right. And, X number, I don't know, I haven't followed the Weinstein case, are not making that up. But, there's a little, it gets a little complicated because somebody could say, hey, 15 women in the Arkansas Police Department are not making up, even if one of them is making it up, 15 of them aren't making up sexual harassment or hostile work environment claims against Humphreys. Does it teach you anything about when your bullshit detector should and shouldn't fire when a prominent person suddenly faces a rash of claims?
Well, yeah, I think it's case specific. I think I don't think there should be a hard and fast rule. I think that, I'm not crazy about the believe all women all the time approach because we have seen false allegations. But, in this case, there were four women who brought some kind of charge that was characterized as sexual harassment. Burks then claimed it was 12 when it was only 4. And he, specifically named women to me who I knew denied ever having any, bad interaction with Humphrey. And then if you look at the 4 women who made the accusations, they're all part of this same kind of social circle, which was kind of headed by this assistant chief who was suing Humphrey at the time. So, I think, I wouldn't draw any sort of broad kind of lessons or rules from it. I think you do, but particularly as a criminal justice for somebody who's been reporting on this stuff for a long time, I think, accusations, you need to look at the context, look at the credibility of the people making the accusations, look at the incentives of the people making accusations. I think all that matters, definitely.
Word up.
Yeah.
Just do the work. That's the...
But okay, so the lesson, no, actually, Ben, I think that the lesson is that we have moments like this in history and time in which we reflexively rely on norms and shaming and ostracization, all of these types of things to kind of move the law forward or get the law to recognize things that it should have been recognizing all along, like taking sexual assault seriously, taking domestic violence against women seriously, taking police violence against Black men seriously, like all of, or police malfeasance seriously. And we have these that doesn't mean that we have to rely on those types of norm enforcement mechanisms forever, nor should we. They are absolutely shit measures, like, and they're the last resort of like
but there's this problem that I'm just speaking from the user point of view, right? The user of the app. You pick up your Twitter in the morning and you see your Arkansas Democrat Gazette story saying 4 women file sexual harassment claims against police chief, and you need to make you need a heuristic to make a judgment. Is this bullshit, or is this part of the Me Too thing?
Yeah.
Right? And like, we're humans, and so we don't you know, we have an urge to apply a rule. And
I know.
What I take Radley to be saying, the rule is that there is no rule. The rule is that you actually have to look at the facts.
No, you didn't let me finish. I was going to say, like, that is like, so what I was going to say is, like, you said word up, like, it's like, what did you say? Like, it's like, you have to look at the specifics, or you have to look at, like, it's like really hard. Like, that's something, it felt that's what you said. But my point is, like, yes, it is really hard, but it's not just for individual people to determine. It's for individual people to know that there is no fucking heuristic for claims like this.
Right.
That is exactly the thing that I'm trying to say, is like, there is no heuristic for these types of claims. They are arduous, terrible things that, like, have to be slowly and best litigated through some type of procedural transparent mechanism with accountability, like a court system, which is like the shittiest but best thing that we have. And it's much better than a court of public opinion, precisely for this reason, because the second that someone sees it as a tool to twist against a person they don't like, they will do that. And it becomes not like a righteous hammer, it becomes like an unwieldy hammer that is like swinging and hitting everyone in the head. And so, like, my point is basically just that, like, there are things that we have, and they're called the rule of law. And this is, like, actually, like, why, as I was describing before, these are really hard questions that you could go through 9 years of litigation to try to figure out. And, like, even in that case, you don't have, like, a totally clear set of facts that points in one specific way or another under the law. And so, like, I think that, so this is not one of those, but, like,
I mean, look, I think Believe All Women is a response to a time when it was believe none of the women and laugh it off and wink and nod and sweep it under the rug. Like, it's, you know, we shouldn't believe every woman who makes every accusation, but we should take every woman who makes an accusation seriously and look into the accusation and, you know, treat it, you know, for the serious alleged incident that it is.
Yeah, totally. Mike Godwin, you're not on camera, but I can hear your voice.
Sorry, I'm going to turn a light on because it got dark.
Yeah, you keep like going. You're fine. Don't worry. Mike, go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. So I actually have 2 questions, but they're kind of related. Can I just say them all at once?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. The worst that'll happen is we'll cut you off brutally.
It's not that long of a series of questions. So the first question is, isn't the problem with Little Rock's police just an exemplar of the problems with American police culture generally? And is there a generalizable policy or legal solution or set of solutions that would address not only Little Rock's problems, but those of so many other cities? The reason I ask this question, by the way, is that this could have been, your story, Radley, could have been set in any other city, and it would not have seemed weird to me to have all the details that you've related.
Yep. So I mean, it has happened elsewhere.
Yeah, I think it has happened in many other places. Anyway, I'll stop now and just let you take those questions.
Thanks. So yeah, I list a bunch of cities that the other cities where this has happened, where literally you have a black police chief who was been accused of everything from sexual harassment to retaliation, anger issues. And, you know, in most cases, the allegations have not panned out. In Kansas, the head of the state police faced these allegations, state did an investigation and found that basically it was an effort by officers who he had disciplined, who didn't like the fact that they'd been disciplined. There's currently a lawsuit from the former black police chief in Henderson, Nevada, who was hired as a reformer, brought down sort of by the union, and she's now, alleging that they made all these sort of false allegations against her. So it is happening in other places. As for, what we can do, I think the first thing that needs to be done is that we need to diminish the power of these unions. In Little Rock, the black officers don't feel like the FOP represents them, and yet the city grants the FOP as the sole recognized collective bargaining unit for police officers in the city, and that's a problem.
Can I ask a question that is a little bit ignorant about police unions and unions in general? Is the anti-police union movement like linked to an anti-union, like anti-Teamster, anti-union kind of sentiment generally, or is it kind of its own thing because of the politics around police?
It's its own thing. I mean, I think you as a libertarian, I think there are similar arguments that can be made against other public sector unions, although obviously the stakes are much different, but the incentives I think are similar. But no, I think private sector unions, I think private sector unions do a lot of good. I think there are problems with some of them also, but as a libertarian, I always like to point out to my fellow libertarians that it was, a union that brought down communism in Poland, right? But I think police unions are unique. And one of the ways that they're unique is in that when a city doesn't have the budget to, say, guarantee raises or guarantee, better pensions, they compensate by giving the officers themselves more control over discipline. They make it easier for bad officers to not be disciplined or to stay on the force. They make it harder for the city to, win terminations. And this has happened in Little Rock a lot. In Little Rock, I've never seen a police department that has been where internal policy and personnel decisions are so dictated by litigation. And what happens is an officer will get, a white officer will get away with something, some terrible, incident. And, 7 years later, a black officer will do something similar and get fired. And then he'll sue and say, well, you let this white officer get away with it. And they'll win their jobs back, or it'll happen in a reverse order. And what happens is you get this sort of race to the bottom for bad behavior. So once one officer has been cleared for a particular type of incident, it clears the way for every other officer who's ever accused of something similar.
But isn't it it seems to me like a bit of a spectrum, because police unions, there's always been a divide in the way we understand unions between public sector unions and private sector unions. And police unions, teachers unions, corrections officer unions, they raise all of the questions that you just described in a way that, unionizing Amazon or a hotel does not, except that the police forces are also, as are the corrections officers unions, which don't get nearly enough scrutiny, in my view. They also have the power of life and death over people in their communities. But I'm not sure the issue is different in kind from the issue of, teachers unions. It's just an issue of degree, right?
Yeah, the stakes are different, I think. But yeah, I think the incentives are very similar.
Thank you for explaining that. I didn't mean to be obtuse. I just all of a sudden just I was like, I wonder if these carry over. But anyways, Richard Wattenberger, it's so nice to see you.
Hello. Nice to see you. So a little context for my question. First of all, I'm in Philadelphia, and which is a majority minority city, majority black city, and we have problems with obviously we have problems with the FOP here as well, and it's to the extent that it becomes fodder for GOP politicians outside of the city to run us down. I'm just wondering what in Little Rock how this story was covered, and if you have a sense of what sense you have of how the people in Little Rock especially in the metro area, especially outside of the city limits, how they viewed the police in this situation. Does this confirm, for example, prejudices that some people have about Little Rock, or what's the general sentiment there?
Yeah, so it's hard for me to say what the general sentiment sort of in Little Rock or the metro areas. I don't think there's polling that's kind of that geographically precise. We'll see. There is an mayoral election coming up, and I think the police department has been in the news enough that that's going to be a central issue in the campaign. So I think that's probably where we'll find out how this is resonating. As for local coverage, man, I got to tell you, with the exception of the Alt Weekly, which has been pretty skeptical of the union and the claims against Humphrey, it's been pretty anti-Humphrey to the point of almost parody. And I'll give you a good example. I tweeted about this the other day. It wasn't in the article, but so we'll go back to our friend Chris Burks. Burks filed a email.
Generous use of friend there, Radley.
He sent an email to the Arkansas Attorney General telling them that they needed to investigate Humphrey for this alleged woman he was having an affair with, who he was trying to get a job for. And he got, from what I understand, and I'll add that I haven't seen it, but from what I understand, he got sort of a rote response saying, thank you, we'll look into this. He then goes to local radio or local TV station, KATV, and tells them that there's a state attorney general investigation into Humphrey, citing his email in the response to it, right? They then run the story sort of uncritically. Burks is the only source that there's any such investigation happening. The very next day, Burks then emails the city attorney and the city directors saying, basically using the fact that there's an attorney general investigation into Humphrey as leverage for his demands that the city turn over, documents and information and conduct their own investigations into Humphrey. And for his sort of evidence that there's an attorney general investigation, he cites the KATV story for which he is the only source, right?
Sorry, that's just yeah. Okay.
So 19 months later, nobody I talked to has heard anything about this investigation. Nobody's been interviewed. There's been no press release, no indictments, nothing.
Crazy.
It's just, I think, and my tweet thread about this, I talk about, local journalists. I think they have this kind of symbiotic relationship with local law enforcement, particularly in a very, relatively small city like Little Rock. They need those people to do their jobs. And so they tend to not be skeptical of them. A guy like, Burks or like the FOP or the assistant chiefs, they have long existing relationships with local media that they can exploit. A guy like Humphrey is an outsider. He comes in, he doesn't have those relationships. He's also not allowed to talk on the record to defend himself. So it becomes very easy for these people to kind of leak information to local media through these existing relationships. And there's no kind of pushback. And so there were some ridiculous allegations. I mean, there was one big story about how Humphrey had run a red light because a truck that looked like his was caught on a traffic camera running through a red light. No effort to verify it. They end up pulling the story when he proves that he was in another side of the city.
I was just going to say, that sounds like a defamation suit waiting to happen.
So this is a really, really important point that, the smaller the jurisdiction, but it's true at the federal level too. If you work in counterterrorism reporting, you have people who you've interacted with in the bureau as repeat players in investigations, and those are people that you have good reason to. They've provided you good information in the past. They do briefings with reporters, and you have their number. And so when something happens, the first thing you do is you pick up the phone and call them, or you send them a text or whatever. And this is really magnified when you shrink the situation down to and that it is profoundly biasing when those people are, not chasing terrorists, but going after their bosses.
Yeah. And
it's just profoundly biasing.
I mean, I get really infuriated when local reporters, particularly TV news reporters, do these kind of fawning pieces, or they they take an accusation unskeptically and run with it. I do kind of have to remind myself, though, as somebody who's a reporter with more of a national focus, like it's very easy for me to parachute into a place like Little Rock, not really care who I piss off, because I don't need these people as sources, to do my job on a day-to-day basis. And so, as much as I wish journalists to be more skeptical,
and I think more importantly and less corruptly than that, that because you're parachuting in, you haven't had 10 years of interaction with that person that causes you to build trust and makes you a little bit blind to the fact that that person is now not giving you objective information about a case that he or she is working, but is actually sliming somebody.
Yeah.
It's so, it's just so true. I will,
and this is where competition would help, if there were 3 or 4 papers.
But this is I just want to say, this is not just in reporting. It's not just in policing. It's not just in the courts. It's I used to when I was at ABC News and I started straight out of college, I didn't think that they were doing a very rigorous job in checking to make sure they got the rights for a lot of the photographs that they were using. In fact, I knew that they weren't checking at all. And I said this to my boss, and she was like, we have to work with these people every day. Don't piss off the graphics department. Right. Don't piss off the graphics department at abcnews.com, because we have to work with them every day. And I mean, there was no huge scandal, but it was it's all politics all the way down. You're going to have, you don't want to challenge these people. And you come in with you're 21, 22 years old and they think you're an asshole and you think they're idiots. And
nobody wants to make their job harder for no particular, well, even for a good reason, much less.
Yeah. Yeah. And they've gotten into a way of doing it. And it's that's the story. So, David, great question to take us a little bit outside the scope of the talk, but it's a great question. It's one I always want to ask Radley. So I'm selfishly asking you to ask it for me.
Okay. All right. I will do it. So since you've written a lot about asset forfeiture, I was wondering if you could provide an update on whether states or the federal government has made progress on dealing with asset forfeiture.
So there have been some successes. I should confess I'm a little bit behind on this because I've been working on a few other issues, but I do know that over the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen a number of states pass laws requiring a conviction in order for police to seize property, through asset forfeiture laws. The Trump administration, the Obama administration made this sort of gesture at reform where they said there's this policy called adoption where, or equitable sharing, where if a state has passed restrictive asset forfeiture laws, the police department in that state can say, if they have a case where they think there's going to be a lot of property to be forfeited, they can call up, say, the local DEA branch or local FBI and say, hey, can you federalize this case? And they can just sort of send maybe one officer over, or sometimes not even that. And then it becomes a federal case, which is governed by federal rules, which in a lot of states give the police more power to seize property. And then the federal government takes 20%, and the rest of the 80% goes back to the local police department. The Obama administration said, in order to do that, the federal agency has to actually actively participate in the investigation. You can't just sort of call them up and federalize it. And that, affected, I think I tried to crunch numbers, and it affected maybe 5 or 6% of forfeiture cases overall. But at least it was kind of a gesture, and it was admitting that, okay, we recognize that this is a very unjust policy. The Trump administration then revoked even that modest reform, and the Biden administration has yet to re-implement it or any other sort of reforms. So there's a little bit of backsliding there. I would say at the state and local level, I think things are definitely getting better. Unfortunately, last week, there was one counterpoint where Lori Lightfoot, the mayor of Chicago, announced her sort of crime fighting strategy. And one of her 2 sort of policies that she mentioned was setting minimum goals for asset forfeiture in the city, which, there have been studies done in Chicago. I think Reason Magazine did one and found, that the average amount of money confiscated in a forfeiture case, I want to say it was under $1,000. And of course, it's in, all the kind of poorest, blackest areas of the city. And so, it's a policy that's both regressive and the idea, the whole point of asset forfeiture is we're going to rob these big kingpins of ill-gotten gains. And when your average forfeiture is less than $1,000, it kind of shoots that argument to hell. But generally, I think things are getting better. There's been a little backsliding though.
Yeah. We're going to leave it there.
We are.
So I beat you to it, Ben.
You did. I was literally saying we are going to leave it there. But I wanted to got it. Really,
Radley, did you see that meme go? Well, that wasn't a meme, but did you see the link going around of that shitty team of cops that had like taken like a pound of stems off of like some poor guy and had like
bills laid out in a row?
Yeah, the $1 bills laid out on the table was like $74.24 or something. I was hoping you'd seen it and enjoyed it. I knew you probably had, but I just
I was also enjoying the riffs on it, which was
it was like great. Oh, I'm so glad those guys got dragged. It was amazing. But Ben,
we will be back tomorrow. We have no idea who the guest is going to be. Maybe it'll be a guinea pig. Maybe it'll be an emu.
Ben, remember when I asked you if I should get 2 naked guinea pigs as pets and adopt them?
And I objected on grounds that they're rodents.
And now you're wearing them on your shirt?
No, okay. This is a clothed guinea pig. It is...
it's a clothed guinea pig, yes. It's not a naked guinea pig.
I don't do nudity in rodents. That's inappropriate, Kate. That'll be 22 hours and 55 minutes from now. And until then, KK?
We don't have fun anymore. But we do have Radley Balko's incredible, very long, but really, really worth the read. I hope you kind of are thinking of turning this one into your next book friend to talk about later on your next time you're on the show. Piece in the Intercept that we have linked to throughout the day, and I'm throwing in one more time into the chat. And thank you so much for joining us, friend. It's great to see you. Merry Christmas.
Thanks for having me on. Take care, guys.
Bye.